Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this month for Side by Side Digital. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. So this month we're tackling family living. Family living is something that sometimes one of those overlooked categories of expenses that can be a major contributor to your farm's financial success or struggle. We've got a special guest on today to help us navigate some of these challenges. Lavelle Windsor farms with her family in eastern Kansas and works as a farm analyst for K-State. Lavelle's going to share some of her tips and advice when it comes to family living expenses.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about family living expenses. I know this is a very busy time on the farm, so I appreciate you taking these few minutes to join us and talk about this important subject. I know that family living sometimes is not the most interesting topic to talk about, but it is just critically important. So I appreciate you taking the time. Before we get started with the talk about family living expenses, I want to tell you a little bit about my role and what I do that kind of and where a lot of my learning has come from of helping families with this. So I work with Kansas State University, K-State Research and Extension, and I am a farm analyst or farm financial analyst. So what I do, particularly during the winter time, during the times that are not quite as busy on the farm, is I am actually on farms a couple of times, probably 3 days a week during the winter months, working with farmers on their finances. Sometimes that might be a very difficult issue where maybe some financing needs to be, maybe we need to look at refinancing something, or maybe there's a cash flow issue or something like that. And maybe it's even working with a family with their lender to get something set up more streamlined so it works better for the farm. Sometimes that is an expansionary measure that we're looking at is, okay, we want to add this expansion into our operation. Maybe it's buying land, buying some machinery, or redoing something, maybe doing a different enterprise, and I'll run that through a financial system that I use, and we'll look at what are the ramifications for that change. And then also I work with families on farm succession, so passing the farm from one generation to the next. And all of those pieces have a financial component because everything we do on our farms involves the finances. So oftentimes, I would say probably 80% of the time when I work with a family, we are doing a financial analysis. And one of the components of that is the family living expenses. And so that's where this topic ties into the work that I do with families. I am also part of a third generation family farm. This picture is my husband and my brother-in-law harvesting soybeans below my house a couple of years ago. And we farm between Topeka and Lawrence. Topeka is the capital of Kansas, and then Lawrence is where University of Kansas is at, right along I-70. So we are impacted by the urban sprawl of those cities. That's a piece that's, I grew up in Eastern Colorado where it was fairly desolate with people. And in Eastern Kansas, there's a lot of people and that really, a lot of you may be facing that as well with your farms. So our farm today is still on harvesting corn, but probably tomorrow, the next day, we're going to switch over to soybeans because they're about ready to go. So we're going to start out with a poll question as we kick this off. So the first question is, how do you pay for your family living or household expenses? Okay, so kind of divided. There's two that are pretty heavy here with on-farm and off-farm, or the spouse pays for most of the family living and the farm is contributing to getting those farm expenses paid, are the common answers. Great. Okay, thank you for answering that. Okay, so to start our talk about family living expenses, this was an article that I came across last spring. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of Dr. David Cole. He writes for Corn and Soybean Digest along with some other publications as well, and he's a frequent speaker for agriculture events. But the question that he posed to a group of young farmers was, what business management area would you improve on your farm? And he asked them to identify 3. The top 2 tied, and they were record keeping, upgrading their record keeping, and completing a cash flow. And the 3rd on the list was to develop a personal family living budget. And I found that so interesting, because a lot of times when people are just talking, family living maybe isn't even in the realm of what they're thinking about in terms of their farm. But from my work of working with families, I see it highly important. And we'll talk a little more about that as we go along here. And I'm going to share a few stories of things that I've seen over the years. So, okay, we have a second poll question. What do you think the average amount is that farm families spend on family living expenses? 26, 49, 72, or 98,000 a year, or who tracks family living expenses? 49 and 72 are very close, with 98 behind. And I'm very proud of you for most of you not answering number 1 or 5. That's good. So I'm going to show you some Kansas farm management data. Kansas Farm Management Association is a resource that Kansas farmers have available. Kansas Farm Management is a group of economists who work with farmers throughout the year, and then often they do taxes for them as well. And so they track a lot of this information as we go along. But as you can see down here in the very bottom right-hand corner, 72,000 is the average. So this column is the average for all Kansas Farm Management Association folks, so 72,000. And then the data is broken down a little bit more into just couples. So there's just a couple in the house. This is where for families that their children are 5 years old or younger, the oldest child is 5 or younger, and there's about 4 people in the house. And then it breaks it down by some other segments as well. But if you look at all those numbers across the bottom line, 70,000 is about what it takes. And that's a huge amount of money. It just takes a lot of money to live on. Now, a lot of people, if they're young and just starting out, yes, we might be able to live for less, but there just are a lot of pieces that go into that. We're going to go into these sections a little bit more, a little further into my presentation, but I just wanted to share that information with you. So let's talk about paying for family living expenses. So options for where family living expenses are paid from. What I encourage people to do is have a separate account for family living expenses where they pay their household, have a household checking account so that they pay those expenses out of that household checking account. However, I often see where all expenses are paid from the farm checking account. And I really encourage you not to not do that, to have a separate account set up. One of the options, if all of your income is coming from the farm, if both spouses work on the farm and that's where the income comes from, one option is to sweep so much money from the farm checking into the household checking once a month or every other week or whatever time frame works for your family. We'll just do easy math. If say that you figure that your family living budget is $60,000, sweep $5,000 across every month. And what that will do is that will help you to stay within a budget. And it will also help you to track whether or not your budget is realistic. But it will also help you to identify on the farm side if there are issues within the farm side, where those issues are at, and it's not cobbled up with the family living expenses. Because when the family living expenses are commingled with the farm expenses, it's really hard to identify where the problem is. And this eliminates one part. It says, okay, we've got the family living expenses over here. And then we can identify, is the farm, are we able to pay the expenses that we need to? And then we also want you to make a family living budget. And I'm going to give you a tool. I'll show you a tool here in a little bit that you can use to make a family living budget. Okay, I have another poll question I want to ask you, and we're going to go into talking about tracking family living expenses. But how do you track your family living expenses? Some sort of financial software like QuickBooks, a financial app, a spreadsheet, or paper, or again, just who tracks family living expenses anyways. Okay, great. Many are using QuickBooks, a few with an app or a spreadsheet, and some with paper. Yep, that's good. Okay, that's great to see. So I would say that for the folks that I work with, most of them do use some sort of financial software. QuickBooks for farming financial software. QuickBooks is the most common that I use, with Quicken as the secondary one. But in a moment, I'm going to show you the various categories of family living expenses that we use. And what I encourage people to do is to set up a chart of accounts, just like they have their chart of accounts for their farm expenses, but set up a household chart of accounts as well. And then you can put those various items in there, like food and medical and all of that. And then that will, you can set up in your chart of accounts so that you can see on your reports how much you're spending in each one of those categories if you divide it out. Another popular one is to use apps on the phone. I think Mint is the app that Dave Ramsey recommends, or at least that used to be the one that he recommended. I haven't heard him talk about that recently, but I do think apps are probably going to become more and more common as a way to track those family living expenses. I will provide you with this resource when we get done. You'll be able to get this, but these are the family living expenses that we're going to go through here in just a moment. These are the ones that we utilize. How I recommend for people to do is to make a budget, you and your spouse, if you're married, go through each one of these categories and write down what you think is reasonable to spend in a month, and then multiply that out to get to an annual budget. And then every month of the year, track what those expenses actually were. And then at the end of the year, figure out how much you actually spent and look, okay, was I over or under on what my annual budget was for that category? And then also a paper record. I do still see people that use just a paper record to log those expenses as well. So I would say probably, I suppose probably the two easiest ones in my mind from like trying to streamline things are probably either utilizing the financial software, if you can get into a habit of doing that at the same time as you do your farm, the things that you're doing on your farm. Or I can see a lot of value also in utilizing an app, because you just record it. If you can get yourself into the habit of recording it as soon as you make those expenses, you just have it in your app at a moment's notice. So if you haven't been tracking and thinking about doing that going forward, those are probably the two directions that I think would probably be the most streamlined eventually. So let's go through some of the family living expenses. So these are the categories. Anything that's in dark, those are the categories. And then over the years, what I have done when I work with families is if I hear somebody talk about a new area that they spend money in that I haven't talked to somebody about before, then I just add it in there. So like, when we think about food and meals, often people are thinking about, well, what do I spend at the grocery store? But it's not just the grocery store. It's also how much what do you spend in restaurants each week or month? If you have kids, oftentimes you're eating at concession stands for children activities, school lunches, fees on livestock being processed, picking up snacks at the gas station. Those all go into that food and meals. And it's amazing when you start to think about all those other places that you spend money on. It's not just the $100 that you spend at the grocery store that you're spending on food, but it multiplies quite significantly quickly. We will skip down here to household supplies. That tends to be that catch-all category. I often think about it like your Walmart runs, your toilet paper, paper towel, toothpaste, those kind of things, pet food, subscriptions to magazines, upgrades to your kids' phones that aren't something that you would write off on a farm level. So personal care, haircuts, nails, massages, makeup, gym memberships, just trying to think it through all of those expenses and where they would go to. Go into the next ones. A tip that I usually give to people when I think about gifts and when they're trying to think through how much should I budget for gifts, I usually tell people to think about how much they spend for Christmas and then multiply that times 2, because oftentimes whoever we buy for Christmas, we're usually going to buy them a birthday gift also. And then hopefully that captures enough money for some weddings and baby showers and things like that as well. So recreation, that you might have noticed when I shared the Kansas Farm Management data, that is a pretty big category, because, and partially that's because so many things can go into that. One time I did an analysis with somebody and we got all the way done and their family living expenses were pretty reasonable. And we got down to the end and they're like, well, where do I put my college football tickets in? Which of course is a pretty big expense. And, and then we kind of came up with some other things. One time I was with a family and we were at family living expenses, and the little boy had gotten off the school bus and he was sitting at the table with us and eating his snack, and we're just working through the family living expenses. And the little guy, he's like, you guys forgot one. And he's kind of like laughing, and he goes, you forgot about the beer. And so then I added alcohol and tobacco under the recreation area as well. So just trying to think through what are all of the expenses that you might have, and just trying to fit it into one of those categories that makes sense for you. Household repairs, there are so many people that want to put 0 in that category, but I usually recommend $1,000 to $2,000 for household repairs. And part of the reason that I want people to do that is you might have an appliance or 2 that goes out in a year. You might not have anything that goes out for 5 years, but all of a sudden you might have a couple of things that goes out, or you need some new furniture or some house maintenance. Who knows what it is? But I think it's better to plan on having some of those expenses than not, because that's where you end up short money. And honestly, in today's, I probably need to update that to probably $2,000 to $3,000, just because all of that stuff is a lot more expensive. Inflation has just really kicked in and it's more expensive. So, and then these are kind of those insurances, and then retirement savings as well. So that is the list of expenses that we work with people on. So the family living expenses that we have people break down into those categories. And I try to work through most of those categories with them so that we can capture and get to a grand number of what the total family living expenses are. So we're going to switch over here for just a moment and talk a little bit about retirement savings. So we have another poll question. And just, do you or your spouse have retirement accounts? So yes, and I fully fund it. Yes, but I'd like to make more contributions. No, I don't have a retirement account, but I'd like to set one up. no, I don't have one, and I don't plan to, or I'm too young to think about retirement accounts. Ah, very, very good. I'm happy to see this answer. So good. So it looks like several do have a retirement accounts, and they either fully fund or they're working their way towards making more contributions. That's great. I'm glad to see that. So let's talk a little bit about why it's important to save for retirement. And maybe with those answers, I might be preaching to the choir. But so as I said earlier, I often will do a financial analysis with families, and if it's a sole proprietor, we're often talking about personal assets as well. And I'm just going to tell you, and maybe you'll just have to trust me, but there is a significant difference in the operations that I work with for the ones who have retirement savings. And when I'm saying retirement savings, I'm saying an adequate amount of retirement savings that they actually could retire with versus the ones that don't. And it's amazing with the compounding interest. Just if you can start to set money aside as a young person, it's just amazing what a difference that will make for you later on in life. And it will give you so many more options than some of your peers will have if they don't understand the importance of it. So if you are only working for the farm, an IRA or an individual retirement account might be the best place to go. I usually feel like in many, many instances that the Roth IRA is a better direction for a young person. And the reason is you are paying the taxes on those dollars today, but then the growth grows tax-free. So when you retire, you're taking out all that growth and not paying taxes on it the way that the laws are set up today. And that is just an absolute amazing opportunity. There's a lot of people who like traditional IRAs because they get to deduct the interest or pay the tax, get the tax deduction today, which it's kind of a short-sighted reason that is advantageous. And you then you do pay taxes when the money comes out. Well, oftentimes, if you're invested in a mutual fund or in the stock market, in some ways, the trajectory is that money is going to increase in value in many instances. Well, then you're going to pay the taxes on so many more dollars if we continue on that trajectory. The limits for IRAs are $6,000 per person in 2021. Every few years, those limits change just a little bit. I think they're 6,000 for 21 and 22, and then they might go up another $1,000. But if you can set aside $500 a month, $125 a week, or even if it's less than that, just setting aside some amount of money and investing that in retirement just makes a huge difference later on. If you or your spouse works for an employer, if you have access to a 401k or a 403b or some other retirement vehicle that your employer will give you matching dollars, that's amazing. I mean, it's like free money. The employer that I worked for before this, they, for whatever I invested up to 6% of my salary, they would match 50 cents on a dollar. So 3% of my salary, if I did that, they were giving to me free. And I just think that's almost a no-brainer, one of those no-brainer situations where you really, really need to do that. And if you do have access to an employer retirement plan, you can also do the IRA as long as you're not making too much money. There are some guidelines with that, but many young people are not pushed into that higher end category where they're excluded from the IRA. So I really encourage you to think about that. And that is a piece of your family living expenses, but it's something that I really think will pay dividends for you to do later on in life. it is really important to focus on your habits, your financial habits early in your career. And that's either farm or family. The decisions that you make now will really, truly impact your future. So, going ahead and making a family budget now and getting into the habit of doing that. It's simply just a habit, really. And then working through that. From the farm financial side of it, I have a family that I think they have probably done 35 financial analyses over the years. I mean, they do one a year. I've probably been involved with 15 of them. And they tell me that that is their time of the year that they set aside just to have a checkup on their financials and make sure that their farm is doing okay. We're creating their budgets at that time. We're looking at how we're projecting the cash flow to go for the next year. And then from that, then they can make their decisions of what kind of expansionary measures they're going to do. And they made that habit very early in their career, and they're still at it. And it's all of those things are just really important. Another thing that I want to encourage you, because I think most of you are young farmers, is consider getting involved in some sort of agriculture organizations like the commodity organizations or Farm Bureau or Farmers Union. Many of those have leadership opportunities. It's just like this one. I mean, has an opportunity to network with other farmers that are like-minded, and they may be in a little bit different area than you, but that is a great opportunity. And so I just want to encourage you to do that. One thing before we go on to questions, I just want to share with you kind of a trend that I have seen in the last few years is there are a lot of farms that I have worked with, and particularly I'm thinking about younger farm families where one spouse is working off the farm and the other spouse is on the farm full time. And I've witnessed where the person who is working off of the farm has become under a pretty significant amount of stress because they, in many of those cases that I'm thinking of, they're paying for 80 or 90% of the family living expenses, almost the entire amount of family living expense. They're also providing the benefits and the health insurance for them and their family as well. And those things are okay, particularly if the on-farm spouse is working towards paying down land and things like that, kind of plowing money back into, and you're both on the same page that that's what you guys are doing, is that both spouses are on board with that money going back into growing the farm. But if there's not growth and there's not ability to do that, and there's no money coming back into the family living, it's something that you've really got to look at the farm operation and see if there's profitability there, and see if there maybe needs to be some sort of growth or re-looking at the enterprises so that there are additional funds to be able to support your family as well, because that is an important piece as well. So I just wanted to mention that because I've seen that particularly with young families, especially in the last 10 years or so, and just a lot of stress that has caused within the families as well. So with that, let's go on to some questions. That's always the best part. So
it is. And Lavelle, thank you so much for all of those insights. We've got some great questions coming in, so I want to get to those right away. But before we do that, there's one more question I have for you. Having a conversation around money and finance can be really, really hard for families and couples. What are some strategies that you see successful, farm families exercising to really have those good conversations?
Yeah, and it's nobody wants to be involved in those conversations. except for maybe me. I kind of like them actually, but they are very stressful. And so I really think that it's probably setting aside the time and making a priority to have the conversation, particularly if it's either farm or the family living expenses. Doing something like that worksheet that I shared with you, and taking some time to work through that to set a budget, that's a good place to start. Because I remember several years ago, even myself, who works with people on these numbers every single day, I was like, huh. I mean, I tend to be a pretty frugal person. So I was like, oh, we don't spend that much on family living, which is the answer everybody has. Nobody thinks they spend very much money on family living. And when I added it all up, I'm like, son of a gun, that is a lot of money that and it is. And I look at it, I think about cell phone plans, electricity, just everything costs a lot of money.
And those expenses do tend to get away from us pretty quickly too. That's what I would say from personal experience.
Yeah.
I've got a couple questions that are pretty closely aligned. So I'm going to kind of squish them together. How often should you track it? What's the cadence to the tracking of the actual expenses? Is it every week, every month, every 2 weeks? And then at the same note, do you have any tips for kind of staying on track for updating budgets? Because it's real easy to, like, I'm going to do this, and then 3, 4, 5 months down the road, boy, that the wheels fall off the wagon completely. So what is your advice on that?
Yeah, and it is hard. So personally, what I would encourage people to do is, whatever your routine is for paying bills, I think it makes sense to track those expenses whenever you're paying bills, and just have that as part of your habit with when you're doing your finances. On our own farm, I'll just share with you what I do is, on almost every single Monday, I have a couple hours set aside that I pay all of our farm expenses, and I pay our household expenses as well. It's just a routine that I've had since I was probably 20 years old. And then whenever I do have a family living expense, I just put it into QuickBooks, just like I do with any of our farm expenses as well. And that's a routine that works for me. I have a money podcast that I listen to, and the routine that they share that they think is really helpful to people is to have an app on their phone, and then just while you're at the grocery store, you enter that expense. You're at the gas station, you enter that expense right at that moment. I don't know that would be a routine I could get into, but I think it does work for some people to do it that way.
And I know a lot of the apps now you can link up your account so it goes right into it. So they're making it easier and easier for us all the time.
Yeah. And that's a good point, because I think there's a way, like if you do a lot of your stuff through your credit card or debit card, I think there's some linking that you can do directly to your QuickBooks with that as well.
So is there kind of a typical number? I know we talked about averages at the beginning. Is there a typical family living number per adult and per child that we should be benchmarking ourselves against?
So I have seen some things that various banks have used, but I don't know how accurate they really are, because when I work with people, I try to get them to go through all of those categories and really share with what they're actually doing. But now this benchmark that I'm going to tell you is probably 5 or 6 years old. So these numbers I think would actually be higher today. But I had a bank that I used to work with, and what they plugged in was $20,000 per adult and $10,000 per child. But just with how much inflation has gone up in the last year or two, I would say those numbers certainly have to be a little higher, probably 25 per adult and maybe 12 or something per child. So so I don't think it's exact, but if you have nothing else to go on, that's probably not a bad place to start thinking about. And then if you make your budget and then track how you actually spend compared to what your budget was, I think at the end of a year or even at the end of a quarter, you would have a pretty good idea of where you're probably at for an annual expense.
When in a partnership, so not two households, these are two separate households, right? How do you track or determine what is actually family living expenses? So the biggest issue that they're seeing is like the keeping it fair issue between the two families. So if one person sets it up under one accounting system and the other maybe isn't using that same system for their household expenses, how do we have these conversations and how do we make it fair in these multi-family operations?
Okay, so thinking about what is the fair amount of withdrawals per partner, I think is what that's getting to in the bottom line. I think there's a couple of different ways that you can go with that. One, is it the responsibility of the farm to pay all the family living expenses if one party is higher than the other party? Is that a responsibility? Or is it what the farm can afford to pay? Is that what should go out? Equally, if the job responsibilities are equal. There's a lot of different directions that you can go with that question. And ultimately, it's going to result in needing to have good communication among the parties and figuring out what is workable. The bottom line to that answer of what I would have in the farm when I'm working with a farm is, first, we need to make sure that your farm can afford to pay out whatever those withdrawals are. We need to make sure that the farm is profitable enough so that you can withdraw whatever amount of money it is that you're wanting to withdraw. Because we might need to work on a profitability or an expansion opportunity if the farm is going to cover all of those expenses.
We're beginning the conversation of farm transition. How can we adjust our family budget now to prepare and save for that transition in 5 or plus years? Where do we even start?
I guess I'd almost like to have some more background on that of what exactly they're wanting to adjust their family budget from. I guess what I would say is that as you go into the transition, if you're thinking that you're going to have less money, if you need to be able to live on less money for a period of time that's being pulled out of the farm, there may be the need that somebody in the family may need to have more off-farm income coming in. And you may need to tweak those it probably is twofold, maybe tweak those family living expenses downward, and then also maybe have some off-farm income if that's the concern, that the family living budget or the amount that's withdrawn from the farm will be at a smaller amount. I almost feel like I need a little more background on that question. But it's good to be thinking about that, especially if it's a 5-year out. It's good to be thinking about that now.
It sounds like the perfect time to start having conversations with the families to figure out how that's going to work. Yeah. Well, I've got one more. That's about all we have time for here. What percentage do you suggest increasing the budget areas due to inflation?
So that's a good question, because if you look at inflation, if you look at the numbers like that you see on the news for inflation, food and fuel do not go into those numbers. So it's actually usually higher than that. I would probably look at 5 or 10%, which I know that sounds outrageous, but I think that really is the impact on our pocketbooks right now. Rather than specifically, unless you feel like you really, really know what your family living expenses are, I would probably start with making a budget, tracking it, and getting a good handle on what that is first before I thought about making increases in an area because of inflation. So,
well, thank you so much for that, Lavelle. I'm sure that I'm not alone here in saying I wish that you would come join me at my kitchen table and help us sort through all this, because sometimes I think that that's probably what it would take, is that impartial third party to help us get there. But we'll have to settle for this today and look for resources like you in our areas to help us have these hard conversations. So thank you again, Lavelle, for being here today. Thank you in the audience for your participation and your great questions. So we'll be back next month on November 3rd. It's balance sheet season. So we're going to be talking about how to get your balance sheet in order by the end of the year. So We hope you'll join us for that one as well. So until then, take care and see you online soon.